Mr. Chairman. Let me just address the very real conundrum facing government. And it's, as we watch, every terrorist act, the aftermath of that, people start doing a postmortem on that, and they go, well, we had this information. Why didn't we put two and two together and prevent the attack? Very real concern. And it's just that natural tension between privacy and the security that the American people expect. So I guess I'd like all three of you to, first of all, address that very real concern. I mean, how do we navigate that very fine line? I guess we'll start with Mr. Swire.
Thank you, Senator. So I wrote a law review article around 2006 called Privacy and Information Sharing in the War Against Terrorism. It's online, and law professors always love it if anybody ever reads a law review article. But I think that gives a checklist of 7 or 8 questions that I think should be asked as you're building the new information systems. And it actually is similar to what Mr. Rosenzweig's saying about audit and accountability and setting it up so someone's looking at it carefully when you build it at the front end and then auditing it once you have it in place. And I think if you do that, then you do use information intensively, but you have some safeguards in place.
Thank you. Mr. Calabrese.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems with information sharing today is that there's so much information that it overwhelms the ability of any analyst to essentially process it. I mean, you can't connect the dots when it's millions of dots being, given to you every day. And I mean, Secretary Leiter, when he was the director of the NCTC, talked about how some amazing amount of leads and tips they get every day. And so I think that we need to try to weed out the innocent person chaff and focus more on actual leads, actual people who, when Abdul Muttalib's father came into the embassy and said, please investigate my son, it certainly seems possible to me that lead became lost because there was so much information pouring in that a good lead was lost amongst all the chaff. And I think we need to focus on narrowing our information sharing to the right information. And that's a difficult task, but I think that one that will bear the most fruit.
Mr. Rosenzweig.
I actually have a different perspective on that, which is I agree that we're drowning in a flood of data, but to a large degree our capacity to analyze it has been hamstrung by our unwillingness to apply data analytics. Abdul Muttalib is actually a good example because it was the father coming in was preceded apparently by a visa application that would have been in the field of innocent data, presumptively innocent data that was collected about all visa applicants. You can't know ex ante which data fields are going to be the ones that are relevant to an ongoing investigation. Up until just a couple of years ago, we actually did not have a coordinated Google-like search functionality within the intelligence community, not because we couldn't implement that, though it does take some money and the coordinate, but in part because we were concerned about the linkages between various databases as eroding privacy concerns. When you have those concerns at the front end, they sometimes create artificial limitations. I agree completely that the right answer is to try and use the analytics to narrow down leads into the people that we want to devote investigative resources to. That's precisely what all of these systems are intended to do. On the other hand, you can't actually make them as effective as you might by limiting the intake on the front end. So my perspective is that we're always going to be doing too much until the day after an event when we won't have done enough. And the optimal answer is to try and get the right structures in place up front and at least be able to defend your choices going forward.
Mr. Calabrese, I'll definitely side with people who are highly concerned about civil liberties and government intrusion into our lives. Can you describe specific examples of purposeful misuse by the government of some of the information, personal privacy information, as opposed to hackers getting in and information being, not purposefully, but illegally disclosed?
Yes. I mean, let me go address your question first, Senator. I think we saw with the NYPD's investigation of Muslim communities where they were they began to surveil entire communities, do community mapping of Muslims, not because they had any particular belief that there was a particular person who they needed to investigate, but just simply to monitor the entire community. You know, similarly, we've seen reports, and the ACLU has done FOIAs on this, where FBI agents, under the guise of going and doing community outreach and just getting to know the Muslim community, something that I think everybody agrees is vital in terms of building bridges and connections so that they will feel free to come forward if there is a criminal issue, were turned into intelligence reports, where reports were compiled on those innocent people who were trying to help the government and do, you know, community outreach. So when we turn people who are trying to help us into suspects, it builds exactly the kind of distrust that we're trying to prevent, and I would argue hinders investigations going forward. So I think that's the kind of situation that we want to prevent, and we want to, you know, that's why we want to preserve some of the lines that we've been talking about.
That's someone kind of outside what we're talking about here, at least what I'm talking about in terms of privacy within the cyber community. Mr. Rosenzweig, you mentioned Google. I mean, Google has got all the information. If you have a credit card, you've provided voluntarily all kinds of personal information. And I guess I just want somebody to speak to the disconnect between what we voluntarily give up to private companies that have a great deal of latitude, almost probably more latitude for use and misuse of that information than the federal government. Can you just kind of speak to that disconnect?
Well, there's much to be said about Google's privacy policies, which many people think are not strong enough in the private sector. I think the best way to characterize it would be this: just this past week in Las Vegas, they had the Black Hat Convention, DEF CON, which is a convention of hackers, and one of the leaders of the audience asked this assembled group of true cyber experts who they feared more, Google or Google's privacy invasions or the government's, and Google won hands down. You know, because the people with the knowledge about this know that Google actually assembles processes and uses personal data much more efficiently, much more effectively than the federal government does. So if you are one who sees in that a threat, as the people at DEF CON did, they are more afraid of Google than they are of the government by, I think it was like 6-1 I saw in the newspapers. I obviously wasn't there, okay. But that kind of speaks to it, I think.
Well, thank you. I've run out of time again. I really do want to thank the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony and taking the time here. This has been a very interesting discussion, and Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. This is a good hearing.